Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for coming today. Unfortunately, we have limited amount of time and some very wonderful folks here. I'm going to focus my questions with Mr. Robson to start with. Mr. Robson, I commend you for a well-timed opinion piece in the Globe and Mail today. Would like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. But perhaps before we get there, we've had a number of economists before this committee, the Bank of Canada, including some chief economists of financial institutions, who are painting a very different picture about the economy than the one the Department of Finance is painting. Growth is robust. The slack has been absorbed in the economy. Unemployment is below where it was prior to the pandemic. These are all good things. So why is it that we need to continue with significant amounts of deficit spending?
Well, I myself would prefer to see the deficit disappear quite quickly. There was a reference earlier to what happened in 2008, 2009. And what I very much liked about what the federal government did after that episode was that it did, after having run a deficit much bigger than it wanted to, get the budget back to surplus. And that meant that a lot of the bills that would have otherwise been passed forward indefinitely were paid more by the people who benefited from some of the fiscal stimulus at the time. I'm not seeing that same approach this time. And it does concern me, not just that some of the pandemic-related spending has gone on perhaps longer than it should have, but we're seeing other types of spending as well. The federal government's own operating spending, federal government employment is way up. And those things are going to be very hard to rein in when the time comes to get the budget back to balance.
Thank you very much. So what I'm hearing is, you know, the fiscal plan of this federal government is to spend at every single stage of the business cycle, which clearly is not a sustainable fiscal path. You, in your op-ed today, had a recommendation on what you would like to see as a fiscal anchor. Would you just like to comment on that, please?
I think that there's no substitute for a target on the bottom line, and I would like to see it zero when it comes to how much borrowing and what that means practically as a small surplus. My main reason for that is that with the debt, well, two reasons. The debt to GDP ratio has not proved to be a very serious constraint. The other reason is that when you've got a particular target on the bottom line, such as zero, every dollar of spending needs to be justified in terms of the dollar that you don't spend somewhere else or the dollar of revenue that you will raise to pay for it. At the moment, we're in a bit of a spirit of money appearing to be free. Because of the conversation on housing, I'll just say I'd be wary of any program that relies on decades of big federal government subsidies, because I think that the money is going to dry up at some point, and that pinch is going to be less serious the sooner we get on with getting the budget back to balance and the debt under control.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about inflation for a minute. Your initial testimony indicated that many people don't like inflation, but in fact, there's some entities that are significantly benefiting from a windfall of revenues. Who might that be?
Well, I didn't say it in my testimony. There is a protected class. MPs are actually among them. You have indexed pensions. Federal employees have indexed pensions. Most people don't. So for people who don't have indexed pensions, a long period of high inflation is extraordinarily stressful and destructive. Their debtors do benefit from surprise inflation. At the moment, one of the big questions, and it relates to the earlier question about transitoriness, is if inflation continues, how much is it a surprise? At the moment, long-term interest rates are quite low, but they are rising. And one of the things that concerns me about the current episode is that if inflation expectations start to rise and we start to see that feeding through into long-term interest rates, it gets harder for the Bank of Canada to bring inflation back down. If people are still expecting 2% over the long run, then it's not that jarring a change. But once people have started to build in 4, 5, 6 or more percentage increases into their wage and pricing plans, getting inflation down gets a lot more painful.
Okay, thank you. One final question, Mr. Robson. The federal government's actually seeing its revenues increase substantially in this time of inflation. In fact, there's some discussion about governments around the world preferring to let inflation run hot so that it helps them pay off their debts. The Bank of Canada quietly released a paper early March where it talked about the credibility of the central bank and not wanting to bend to fiscal policy when the Bank of Canada was presented with a fiscal plan that doubled the size of the national debt, do you think that the bank had really much choice other than to purchase government bonds if it wanted to keep interest rates low?
A short answer, please.
The Bank of Canada needed to create liquidity in the short run because of the pandemic, but I have a lot of concern that they seem to be taking responsibility for long-term interest rates, not just the overnight rate that they use for monetary policy. And to that extent, I think that they are getting into problematic territory, and the credibility of the low inflation target will be much greater if the government's debt weren't seen as potentially unsustainable.